Obviously what they needed was a way in which a policeman could ask his mate next up the line whether a particular train had cleared the intervening section of track. It came with the telegraph. It arrived in 1841. It hadn't got much of a vocabulary, but it was the first step towards the modern system. With it came an array of fixed signals. Together, signals and the telegraph had the potential to keep trains apart. Now you could check that the line really was clear before you signalled a train on. But that wasn't the way it happened, and they went on regulating trains by the clock. Theoretically, they used railway time, but it tended to vary from station to station. And what's more, with trains going at different speeds, it could be a dangerous business travelling under what was called time interval working. The answer was block working and spacing in distance, not time. It involved dividing the track into sections, each with its own signal. Telegraph messages from box to box now controlled the trains. If one has to stop, then the next signal back holds a second train. Now, not until the section is really clear can another train go into it. Space block working is a cornerstone of the modern system, but it was to be a very long battle before the wisdom of it was accepted. The first two sections were set up in 1841. Both were in tunnels, one in Derbyshire and the other at Clayton, just outside Brighton, where the line runs under the South Downs. At Clayton, two signalmen, one at each end of the tunnel, controlled signals that told a train whether or not it was safe to enter. The trains themselves automatically reset the signals to danger as they passed. The two boxes were connected by telegraph instruments that could pass simple messages about whether trains were in the tunnel or not. On the morning of Saturday, the 25th of August, 1861, Brighton station was crowded with holidaying Victorians. Extra excursion trains had been arranged by the company, the old London to Brighton line, and the timetable was so crowded that 3 trains were due to leave with only 14 minutes between them. In fact, they left with only 7 minutes between them, and by the time they'd climbed the gradient to Clayton, they caught each other up even more. The first train went into the tunnel only 3 minutes ahead of the second. Once the signalman had watched it into the tunnel, he signalled train in tunnel to his colleague. Then he noticed to his dismay that the trains passing had failed to set the signal to danger, and the next train was fast approaching. Frantically, he tried to work the signal by hand, but in vain, and as a last desperate measure, he seized his red flag. So, against his wishes, the second train disappeared into the tunnel. Now, he was in the last hours of a 24-hour shift, and he wasn't thinking very clearly, so he did the obvious thing. Once again, he sent off train in tunnel to his colleague. Now he was left with a problem. Had the driver of the second train seen his flag or not? There was no obvious way of telling what was happening in the tunnel, but at least one good thing had happened. This time, the automatic resetting of the signal had worked, so the third train stopped. Now the flustered and very tired signalman had to decide whether or not he could release it. The question he needed to telegraph was, is second train out of tunnel? But the equipment couldn't ask that, and so he signalled, is tunnel clear? When he got the answer, train out of tunnel, He reckoned that the second train had got through safely, despite his attempt to stop it, and so he flagged on the third train. The driver of the second train had the red flag and had stopped his train. He'd then begun to reverse back to the box to ask what was the matter. The tunnel clear signal had come from the other box because at that moment a train was leaving the tunnel, but it was the first train, not this one. 23 people had died and 176 were seriously injured. But the inspecting officer, Captain Sir Henry Tyler, argued that despite the Clayton Tunnel accident, continuous space block working coupled with the telegraph was still the safest way to run a railway. In their report, the inspectorate fought for its use. John Chester Craven of the railway company disagreed.
My board state frankly that they still feel the telegraphic system of working will augment rather than diminish the risk of accidents.
Today's Chief Inspecting Officer, Colonel Robertson, still feels strongly about space working.
We fought to obtain this for many, many years, and we finally won. But in winning it, we had to meet and overcome a great deal of antagonism from the railway companies, some of whom were extreme laggards in adopting space interval working, but some of them adopted it fairly quickly.
The laggards didn't finally give in until 30 years after Clayton. The equipment was too expensive, they said. In the meantime, other battles were fought, and Colonel Yolland, another inspector, suggested a major improvement after an accident in 1874. A goods train arrived in Bowness South sidings with wagons for the north sidings. It was held there to let an express through on its way from Edinburgh to Glasgow. Then, although a second express was due in 5 minutes, the goods train was shunted across. It should have been protected by the signals, but it wasn't, because the second express, running 10 to first, crashed into it to kill the driver and 16 passengers. There obviously had to be a system by which the signals and points were linked in some way, interlocked together so that if the points were set against the main line, then the signals couldn't be cleared for that line. In the frame room beneath the signal box in Victorian ironmongery, this system now appeared. The signals and point levers were interconnected by horizontal bars. A complicated system of slots and notches then automatically arranged things so that a signal couldn't be pulled clear unless the points were already set for the routed controlled. In addition, there were separate locking levers. These you had to remember to pull, but then they thrust a metal bar through part of the signal mechanism. It's the beginning of a system of intelligent levers that won't let you make a mistake. Up to this point in the history of railways, the emphasis had been mainly concentrated on getting rid of human error. But now the emphasis starts to shift to the machinery. But if you're going to put safety in the hands of the machinery, then you've got to make sure that the apparatus itself doesn't fail. At this stage in the evolution of the railways, when a train passed, the first thing a signalman would do was to immediately reset his signals to danger.